Abby, 10 a.m., Thursday, April 11th, 1912. I'll join you on deck as soon as I've tidied up, Abby told Mistress Elizabeth and Miss Lucy. I'm afraid I've got a few things left to do. Elizabeth nodded. We will have a nice stroll and then perhaps a rest on the covered promenade, she said. When you've finished, you can look for us there. Abby fiddled with her skirt nervously. I'll meet you just as soon as I can, ma'am, she said as she turned away. She stacked the plates and cups onto the White Star Line tray, taking notice of Mr. Smiles's untouched food. She draped a napkin across the scones, butter, jam, and fruit, and listened to the stateroom door to close. The uneaten breakfast would be perfect for Felix. She hadn't managed to get anything out of the servants' dining room earlier, and her poor brother was probably starving. He always was starving. As soon as the door latched and her employers were off, Abby wrapped the food in a napkin. She gathered the heavy silver warming trays and their lids, balancing them carefully, and hurried to return them to the serving rooms. She returned to the stateroom just as quickly, rushing to fetch the food she'd set aside before anyone happened upon it. She was jumpy as a rabbit as she started down the maze of passages, one more to deliver Felix's breakfast. Though she looked around anxiously as she went, Abby did not see Miss Lucy until she was descending toward B deck. A moment later, she heard her name being called. Abigail! Abby gulped and quickly hid the napkin of food under her apron. Where are you off to? Miss Lucy asked, peering at her from the top stairs. We're up here on promenade, as you suggested. Abby flushed. So sorry, miss. I just returned the food trays and the ship is so large it has me all topsy-turvy. I think I got a bit lost. Miss Lucy smiled. It can be confusing, she admitted, holding out her coat. It's warmer out than I expected, so I won't be needing this, she said. Would you mind taking it back to the stateroom? Abby nodded and took the heavy outer garment with one hand, holding it to hide the lump under her apron. Of course not, miss. Thank you, and please feel free to leave a bit of the work for later if it means you can join us for the wander. Mother so enjoys your company, and it would be good to get more familiar with the ship. Abby was pleased by the comment, but displeased by the pastry crumbs she saw rubbing from her fingers onto the fine wool of the green overcoat. Of course, miss. Thank you, miss. She sounded like a dolt, but she would say anything to get Miss Lucy to go back to her mother so she could deliver Felix's man-handled breakfast. His stomach was probably growling like a bear's. Abby watched Miss Lucy depart, waiting until she turned a corner. Then she spun around and hurried past the ornately carved clock and down the 3 flights of the grand staircase to D deck. As she rushed towards her cabin, Abby crossed her fingers and said a silent prayer that Constance was out watching passengers arrive from Queenstown, Ireland, where they had moored, the last stop to take on mail and passengers before heading out on the long crossing. She was anxious for Constance's absence, though not because her berthmate loved to prattle on and on and on. Abby was in fact grateful for her rambling roommate. Constance's constant talk helped to make Felix's noise. Their first night on board had been cramped and stuffy in the upper bunk, with the heavy curtain drawn tight, sharing her pillow with a pair of kicking feet with no picnic either, but they'd survived. Before she'd left to get breakfast and dress Lucy and Elizabeth, she'd whispered to Felix to stay put and stay quiet. He'd rolled over and pointed towards his mouth to indicate that he was hungry, of course. I'll be back with food as soon as I can, she'd said softly, but that was well over 2 hours ago. She was out of breath and she pushed open the door to cabin D-22. I've got scones, Felix, she said, once she'd made certain Constance was gone. The curtain was drawn around the upper bunk. Perhaps Felix had stretched out and slept on. She set the coat down on the long sofa and brushed the crumbs off before pulling aside the curtain. "Wake up, Fee!" The words evaporated, and Abby stood with her open mouth. The bunk was empty. "Felix," she called, quickly scanning the rest of her quarters. "Felix!" There was no answer, and no Felix. Worry crawled up Abby's spine like a parade of spiders. If Felix were discovered, they'd be thrown off the boat in Queenstown, or worse. Abby paced in front of the wash basin. What on earth made her think she could keep her feisty little brother in a single room for an entire week? She hadn't even managed a full day. She looked up and caught her reflection in the mirror. It was the reflection of a young girl in far, far over her head. Tears sprang to her eyes, and she watched her chin begin to quiver. She was doing her best, but her best would never be enough to fill her mother's capable shoes. Abby's legs suddenly felt weak, as if she might actually fall down. She missed her mother so much. The girl in the mirror wanted her mother back, and also wanted answers. She jumped so quickly into her mother's shoes that she hadn't had time to wonder how or why her mother had died so suddenly. Perhaps Abby should not have accepted the job Master Miles offered. Everything had happened at once. Philip Miles informed her of her mother's passing and offered Abby her mother's position in the same meeting, after making it quite clear he was doing her a grand favor taking on an orphan with no prospects. She'd been stunned, unable to think. Was the manipulation on Master Miles's part? It seemed entirely possible. Though her mother loved Mistress Elizabeth and Miss Lucy, she had also confided in Abby that she did not like or trust Master Miles, a feeling that seemed to have intensified shortly before she died. Abby remembered finding her mother sitting up late one night just a few weeks before she disappeared. She had come into their tiny sitting room to spend a bit of quiet time together, as they liked to do after Felix was asleep. But that night, Maggie O'Rourke was preoccupied. She was sitting very still, staring at a scorched piece of paper and talking to herself. "Mama," Abby had called softly. Maggie had looked up then as if she were coming out of a trance. She blinked at Abby and opened her arms wide. She'd embraced her tightly, muttering in Abby's ear about never giving her up. It was such a strange thing to say. Her mother was not a worrier, even after her father passed away. Maggie O'Rourke was quick to laugh and first to count her blessings. Hearing her sound so frightened had made Abby feel unsettled. She'd hugged her mother back extra tightly. "You won't ever have to give me up," Abby had said, and it was true. It would be Abby and Felix who'd be forced to give up their mother. Less than a month later, she was lost to them forever. The truth was that even if she'd been thinking clearly, Abby did not have a choice about Master Miles's offer. She had to care for her brother. She had to care for herself. She was both mother and sister now. As she gazed at the grief-stricken, angry girl looking back at her, Abby realized that Master Miles must have known that she could not refuse. She forced herself to stand taller. "Don't worry, Mama. We will make it to America," she vowed. She felt for her mother's savings, which were tied in a small bundle around her waist. It wasn't much, but it would give them a start. In America, she would send Felix to school. She would work as a maid, or doing laundry, or in one of the factories that were popping up in New York. She and her brother would build a new life, but first she had to find him.